Then thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's session. My name is Phil Vu, and we'll share this session with everyone later on, as well as some of the links that I'll mention throughout today's session. But the goal today is to show you some pretty neat things with PolicyMap. There's probably some interest about loading data, so we'll talk about that. And then I think while we're there, I'll show you some really unique ways to use that data once it's loaded into PolicyMap into some of the other features of PolicyMap. But really, definitely want to show you how to use the mapping tool, how to load data, how to customize it, some very simple things. And then along the way, if there are any questions, this is, as we all are understand now in the very virtual world, you're welcome to ask questions at any time. There's two really easy ways to do it. You can just type that question into that chat window if you wanted to. And then, of course, at any time, you can just unmute yourself and ask us a question. We do ask if you can, just make sure you mute yourself if you are having in a surrounding that's a little noisier than normal. And that way, everybody can have an easy session. But I'll definitely pause in between parts that we covered just to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask questions. But at any time, you can just ping your questions to me, and we'll try to make it as interactive as possible. All right.
Sounds good.
Cool. So the map tool itself, and if you're not familiar with PolicyMap, I'll give you a really very simple introduction so you have a better idea of the data and the features in the tool. We are part of a larger parent organization called Reinvestment Fund. They are what is called a Community Development Financial Institution, or CDFIs, if you're probably familiar. CDFIs are just a community bank across the US, and most goals of the CDFI is to help revitalize communities through some very unique programs. In the case of Reinvestment Fund, we do things like affordable housing funding, grocery store fundings, community health centers, and even charter schools. And all those goals for us is to build stabilization in neighborhoods. And we've always used data visually to be able to see what those numbers look like across the entire community instead of just looking at it at a zip code or a city or a county. And that's really the genesis of PolicyMap. We wanted to build a tool that anyone can come to, navigate down to the area that they're working in, or maybe the region that they're working in, and start overlaying data and seeing the differences between those places. And what we're going to try to cover today is how to be able to do some basic stuff, like zooming to a place and adding data and understanding it. The map itself is pretty simple. It's just a fully interactive map. You can pan around the map. You can zoom in and out using your mouse wheel, and then the little navigation bar on the right. So basic stuff, I think, we're all familiar with for online maps. The location bar in the very top allows you to zoom the map to the place that you're working in. But as we kind of go through this, you'll realize it's also the tool that you're going to be able to use to add places that you're trying to work in at the same time. So initially, it works like a Google Maps. You can type in an address. It'll zoom to the address. It will drop a little pin in that location. And then from there, you can still pan to different parts of the neighborhoods. You can still zoom in to get really close to the street if you wanted to, or zoom out to get a broader picture of the address itself. But as I mentioned, the location bar also is a search bar, but in this case, a search for geographies. And the goal of this is to give you a place that you can start adding places that you want to look at individually one at a time. So instead of typing an address, I can say I want to look at a zip code, and it'll instead draw the boundary for that geography and give us a chance to understand what it looks like. You can also, though, overlay boundaries that you search for in the very top here in what we call the boundaries menu. This is a really neat menu because this will give you a list of all the different geographies that we use in PolicyMap. And a lot of these geographies might have data aggregated to it or available to those places. And so in this case, if you want to see what zip codes look like on the map, you can simply just overlay the zip code. And instead of having to type in one zip code at a time or multiple zip codes, now you can see all the boundaries at once. If you're familiar with the census, you'll probably recognize these first two columns, mainly because they are generally the census boundaries that we use in PolicyMap. And the way they're ordered is the way that census aggregates data up. So block groups at the very bottom, census tracts, zip codes, cities, county subdivisions, and so forth. We will have the 2020 boundaries and data up tonight. We're just doing some finalized updates to it. So hopefully tomorrow when you log in, you'll be able to see the 2020 boundaries to look at as well. Boundaries themselves are what we consider a piece of data. So with that, we do want to give users some abilities to customize that piece of data. So if you're familiar with block groups, of course, with block groups, you have all the different boundaries available. And of course, block groups form together to make census tracts. And so this neat feature allows you to overlay those two together. And because block groups and tracts generally sit within each other's boundary, they kind of mesh together. So you have some abilities to customize boundaries. And this can come into play later on as you're trying to display data or visualize data differently. But in this case, you can now show how block groups sit within tracts simply by customizing the boundaries a little bit. And then the final part of boundaries that's pretty helpful for a lot of users is the ability to make your own boundaries, because we definitely know that sometimes you are working in an area and that area maybe is a containment of roads or a radius around a given area itself, or even a grouping of other geographies. So we call those things custom regions, and the button very top will give you the ability to make those boundaries in the 3 unique ways. So the draw feature is just that, it's the ability to draw right on top of the map. There's 2 ways to draw as well. You can also, I'm going to zoom into McHenry here. Yeah, you are right next to Schaumburg. There we go. So you can try that one more time. You can draw on top of the map. There's 2 ways. The pencil is just a basic, it's the click and drag feature, whereas the click to point is probably my favorite feature, because then you can just click onto the map and you're dropping the vertices of the area that you're trying to draw. You can still pan around, as you can see. I'm going to really make this difficult for myself and follow a very complicated highway system. But the end is to click onto a point or the first point, and it will close your drawn custom region. And at any time, you can fix this and say, you know, we needed to add Mirror Lake to this or Macomb Lake to this, so we can pull these boundaries down. And when you're done, click Save, and now you have the ability to give it a really simple custom name. You also have some abilities to customize the boundaries itself, things like changing the color, the transparency, and then when you're done, you click Save and Close. And that is a drawn custom region. And the neat thing about a drawn custom region in our tool is that it doesn't care about any of the underlying geographies that we use in PolicyMap, meaning that it doesn't care that you cross block groups or tracks or zip codes or city lines and such. You care about those boundaries when you want to get aggregation for it or download data for it. It'll use a really simple 50% coverage rule, meaning that if I were to, zip codes are really hard. Sorry, tracks one more time. If I were to try to download data for the census tracts within this drawn custom region, it'll use a really simple 50% coverage rule, meaning that at least 50% of the track needs to sit within your drawn custom region or your custom region to be used in aggregation. So in this example here, this little part right here would not be included because the track itself is really large, whereas most of these tracks would generally be contained, except for these 2. But it does mean then sometimes you do need to make a boundary based on other geographies. You're trying to create an assessment area for funding, or you're trying to make a region specifically built on other zip codes or tracks and such. And so with that, it's the assemble custom region. So that's the ability to take boundaries that are in PolicyMap and make a new one out of for your use. It initially defaults to your current zoom level. And then from the menu, you can choose any of the other boundaries to select from. And assembling is just simply clicking onto the map. It's a weird bug that allows us to keep the color scheme. You make a mistake, you can deselect areas at any time. And then when you're done, click continue. Okay, so we've drawn custom region and assembled. The radius is pretty much self-explanatory, so I won't really get into that because they are just boundaries of the map. Custom regions for us do 2 really important things. At first is it allows you to basically visualize the area that you're trying to work in. So this will give you the ability to make really unique maps, start overlaying data and kind of presenting the area that you work in. But they also have quite a bit of customization behind them, meaning you can take them into other features of PolicyMap as well as functionality. The first one's really important for a lot of users is that you can edit any custom region at any time. So that way, if you wanted to reshape this assemble custom region, this allows you to change the boundaries and add and remove boundaries then. But you can also then take your custom regions into other features of PolicyMap, including the reports feature, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You can download data just for your custom region. You can see data in your custom region in a tabular format. And then probably one of the most unique ways for a lot of users is the ability to share a custom region with another user. So this allows you to make a boundary that you're working in, and now you can put it into someone else's account, so they don't have to go through the process of recreating it. They can simply just access the one you create. So when you do create a custom region, it will exist in this View My Region menu. And then from this list, you can see that these are all the regions that you've created. You can access them, and it'll navigate the map to the custom region. But more importantly, as you can see, you can also then access custom regions that were shared with you from other users. All right, so that's my usual open intro for boundaries. Hope to give you some ideas of how to just use the basic stuff, like generally searching around and adding boundaries. Any questions about functionality or features? All right.
I think so far so good.
Cool. All right. So the next step really is what users are trying to use PolicyMap for, and that's the ability to add data. So once you have your maps situated to the place and maybe you've drawn your boundaries you're working in, the next step is the ability to, I apologize, the ability to add data on top. And that data is available in these tabs above the map. And each one of these tabs for us is a way for us to group together data that might feel familiar to the user. And sometimes they are a little overly general sometimes. So it does mean that if you ever just wanted to find out what's in PolicyMap data-wise and not get too lost in these categories, this link in the very top here, the data directory, which I'll send to everyone in the follow-up email. But this is our data directory page, and it's a neat place to go to because this will give you a list, a bit of a summary of all the different categories that we have in PolicyMap data-wise, and then some details within those categories about the data that's in there. And so the way it works, if you scroll down, eventually you'll come to a table of contents, which mimics the categories that we will see back in the tool. And that way, if you wanted to go to, let's say, quality of life, it'll tell you within quality of life, you're going to find grocery retail locations, farmers markets, brownfield Superfund sites. Keep going, you're going to find crime data from the FBI crime report, incarceration data, how people get to work, and so forth. So for us, the quality of life data set is things that generally make an area nicer or worse. The neat thing of this page, though, is that besides giving you a really broad summary of what you're going to find data-wise within the category, it'll give you some really helpful details about that. So things like the years available for the data. So an easy rule of thumb for us is we start our data at 2000. We don't have historical data at this time, something we'll think about in the future, probably next year. But then we'll always have the most current data set available based on the source of the data. So in the case of the census, the ACS is generally produced every year in December. And then with the 2020 census, we'll have that first cut later today. The other really helpful part of this page, though, will also give you what geography data is available at. And this will be really helpful as you're trying to use data in PolicyMap and you're trying to figure out if you're looking at data at a small area, like maybe a city or a small county area, then you want to find data sets that have smaller aggregations. But if you're trying to look at maybe for the entire state or multiple counties, then you can start looking at data sets that are available at counties, zip codes, cities, and such in this process. So in this case, travel time to work is available at the block group level for 2000, but more generally at the tract level for all the years available, and then some other geographies in between, including county subdivisions and such. So it's a great place to start. As you can see, for data-wise, if you're not familiar with what data we have within the tool, within the categories. But sometimes, without having to get too lost in these categories, you can just get to data. And that's using the other search bar in the very top then. And this is a data search for us. So this allows you to basically use keywords that'll match against the metadata that we have for any data sets in PolicyMap. So in this case, if you look for something like, let's say adults with asthma, simply putting asthma in there will give you all the variables in the tool that have related to asthma. And then you can actually see from the source where the data might be coming from as well, which will give you a better sense of how, what type of data you want to use between the two. So in the case of asthma, there's actually two really cool data sets, one from the BERFSIS data and one from CMS. So let's add a couple of pieces of data. I'll show you how to customize it. And then from there, we'll start doing some pretty cool functionality stuff like reports and such. So I'm gonna do a really simple one like income. And this will take us to income data. So when you first add what we call a layer data, and for us, layer data is data that's aggregated to geographies. So this is not address level data sets. So this will always be aggregate data. The legend for a data layer will give you all the tools to read the map, as well as some really powerful ways that you can customize the map at the same time. So the first thing you'll see is a simple sentence, the title of the data itself, which is in this case, median household income. If you ever pull up a data set that you're not familiar with, or you want more information about it, this little eye icon in the legend will open up what we call the data description. Depending on the source of the data, there might be more information in here. In the case of home sale data, it's a pretty vanilla one for us, so there's not a lot to add to it. If you are a data junkie like the rest of us, you can click onto the See Data Directory link. It's in the data description, or See Data Dictionary link, or the source link in the legend, excuse me. And this will take you to our data dictionary page. And this, unlike the data directory page, the goal of this page is to give you a list of every data provider within the tool. And then within each entry, what we try our best to do is be as transparent as possible about how we process the data, if we did any normalizing of the data, where it comes from and such. So in the case of the census, it is probably our most vanilla data set. So these are all the years we pull, the topics, the boundaries. Every data source will have a link to the raw data for anyone that wants to follow that pathway. And then of course, the description allows us to be very transparent about any methodologies that were done to the data sets. And that'll always be the source link in the legend. Otherwise, the legend will give you all the tools to read the map itself. The bottom indicator, which is a shade by, is probably the most important one because it's telling you what geography is being shown or aggregated to on the map. So in this case, it's census tracts. The 2010 after tracts, if you're not familiar, is the year that the tracts themselves were created. So not the year of the data, that's 2020. Meaning that in the 2020 census, we'll have 2020 boundaries here as well. And then some simple stuff then, of course. So anything in the dark purple represents a tract that has a median income of 88,000 or more. The mouse over allows us to see the values of those places. And of course, you can always click onto those indicators and you'll get this really cool bubble. And within the info bubble, you'll have the ability to see trend charts for those places, as well as take it to some other features, which we'll cover in a bit. The legend, though, is also your tool to be able to customize the data on the map. So initially, it is your ability to understand what's being shown by color, by values, and such in geographies. But in this case, you can change the years for income, allowing you to go back in time and see what income was in 2000. See the boundaries changes, even the color for the ranges changes, and even the mouse over changes and the values that click change. The variable is basically how the data is being shown on the map. So in the case of income, the default variable is dollars. But in this, you can actually see a percent change calculations in the variables, either a 20-year change between the decennial census in 2000 and the most recent ACS, or a 5-year change that the ACS suggests that users can compare against. And we'll have the 2020 census in here to compare as well. Variables also depending on the source, will have more or less depending on what you have. So most census variables have about 3 or 5 or so, and then some other really unique data sets, things like home sale data or lending data, or even crime data will have actually more variables to choose from. So if you select percent change calculations between 5 years, you'll see the legend changes from dollar amounts to percentages. And now anything in a dark purple is an increase of 33% or more, whereas anything in a yellowish color is a 2.29% increase or even a less or decrease.
How zoomed in can this data get? Can we go
Sure.
down to block groups?
Yes, yeah. So that's a really great question of how the maps work themselves. Yes, so the way the maps works initially that is it'll show data based on your zoom level. So if you're zoomed out to the entire state, you're generally going to see maybe zip code or county level. But if you're in a county level view, let's say McHenry, you'll probably see tract level. And then as you zoom down, you'll see the map will redraw now to block groups.
Perfect.
So the neat thing is you can then, if your goal is to really look at small area numbers like block groups and tracts, you can lock that geography in. And that way, if you zoom out, the map won't try to redraw into the tracts. Now you can see block group level data at a state level or a county level now instead. So a great question about that feature. And then the last really powerful way to customize data on the map is the ranges itself. So initially, you can do some really simple things like isolate ranges. So this allows you to isolate the high income ranges for block groups or do a combination of those ranges together. But the ranges themselves are a simple quintile, meaning that we take the total number of block groups in this case and lays it out and evenly divides it into fifths based on concentration of data. And so this histogram that you see here by clicking on the ranges will show you that while income ranges for block groups start at about 2,500 and maxes at 250,000, majority of the block groups that actually have income is about between this 35,000 and maybe 90,000 range. So if we do move this slider all the way out, we're not going to get many or any block groups in this case that are in this purple area. And this window then is also a very neat window for you to make your own cut points. So maybe these numbers don't really match what you're trying to identify income-wise in a given area or any of the values that are in PolicyMap. So this allows you to make those values yourself. So in this case, I can click onto this and say, let's bring this number down to below 20,000. Maybe we'll bring this up to, we'll say 48,000, which is median household income for family of 4 poverty, and then 68,000 for national median household income. And then we'll bring this up to 100,000. Oops. And so with a few edits, we're basically simplifying the data on the map. This is probably one of the most powerful ways to customize data because now if you're presenting this map to your readers, they don't have to figure out what the colors really represent in those fuzzy mathematical equations. This is simply telling them that anything in the light color are places that have income below 20,000, which we don't have many or any. But in this case, things in dark purple are above 100,000 and then everything else in between. So the ability to make your own cut points for a data layer is probably one of the most important ways to customize data for your work because it allows you to control the message and the narrative of data that you're trying to present to the audience. And this edit can be for any of the data sets in PolicyMap. So it's not just income. You can identify places that have maybe an increase or decrease in income between the different years. For housing information, you can start talking about ownerships and concentration of ownerships in that value.
Could you explain how we would pull this into like a table if we needed to share just the numbers?
Sure. So there's a couple of easy ways to do it. The best way is probably using the sidebar tool. And so to do that is whatever data you have on the map, use a location to identify the containment. So let's say we want to get all the block groups in McHenry. So use the location bar in the very top. What this will do is it will give us the value from McHenry and then give us these little icons here. And you can download data directly, or you can take this, what we call, into the tables feature. And then from this, what we have now is an interactive map that shows all of the block groups that are in our county that we selected from the very top. So as we navigate through it, it'll highlight it. And then from this, we can download this into an Excel spreadsheet directly.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great.
So the neat thing about this sidebar is that it's also synced to the legend. So let's say we wanted to get more than just dollar amounts. We do want to get percentages. So if we change this in the legend here, then then we do another download, and that download will give us, again, all of the, in this case, tracks in this case, but we can change this to block groups again. And so now the download can be all the block groups in the county. And instead of just the median household income, it's the percent change in household income for those block groups. And then these downloads, I'll just do a really quick one for you so you have an idea what it looks like. But the way the sidebar works is that it's tied to whatever data you have on the map. So if your focus is mainly just McHenry County or a custom region that you created of a bunch of counties, what this will do is, we'll jump ahead a little quickly. Sorry here. This will just give you an idea of what the file looks like. So what you'll get is all the FIPS codes for the geography that you're downloading against, which is block groups. So that's the FIPS code number itself. The format FIPS allows you to use this in another spatial tool. So if you are familiar with things like an ArcGIS or QGIS or even Tableau, you can join this basically data to a boundary file and recreate the layers yourself. But the way the sidebar works, again, is that it's based on what data you have on the map. So we wanted to go from, let's say, income to something like, we'll do jobs for under 30 workers. It's one of my examples for my analytics. So whatever you have on the map, you can change the data and then again, change things like the geography, the variable, whatever you decide. Once you change it in the legend, then you can download that again in the sidebar. So that's the neat thing, is once you have the sidebar up, you can start adding whatever data you want to download into the legend or into the data set, and then update on the legend and re-download again. And the goal is at the end of your download, you will have a bunch of these individual CSVs that then you can join together, because you now have a FIPS code that you actually have a denominator, and just basically merging them together in Excel or so. Cool. All right, so let's talk about one other type of data, but that's a really good question. Any other questions you might have I can answer? All right, cool. So I'll talk about one last type of data, which is what we call a point data set. And then from there, I'll show you how you can do some cool things about adding your own data and then doing the download a more unique way as well. So the other type of data we have in PolicyMap is what we call a point data set. And one of the things you're going to learn about the categories is that the first sub menu for every category are what we call point data sets. And all that means is that they are address data sets in this case. So a point data set is just that. There are icons in the map that represents an address. So in the case of public schools or point data sets, you'll see the little triangle represents a public school. The link in the source takes you to the data dictionary telling you where it comes from. And then each school has a wealth of information that we pulled from NCIS, including things like the basic stuff, like who it is, what it covers, but also important things like the total number, the grades that it covers, the total number of students, student-teacher ratio, and enrollment by class, the demographics of the school, and then what that looks like as an overall percentage of the population of the school. So every school has this information. It's, again, a wealth of data to interact with. And what we wanted to do is turn much of this data into ways that users can filter the points that are on the map. So just like the legend for a data layer allows you to change the colors, the ranges, the years, the variables and such, points have a similar way to customize the data on the map. And there's two unique ways to filter. The first one is probably one of my favorite, and that is the ability to filter by keyword. So initially it starts out, but you can just type in something like the name of a place, and you can search for those places one at a time. But in this case, you can also filter by the keyword of that place. So in this case, only Parkland School will appear. So if there are other schools with similar names that you're trying to query for, you can do that. This works really well for more larger data sets, things like the PPP loan data, which is a really neat one that you can display on the map and then filter by industries or by organizations by their keywords. The other way to filter, of course, is by using the data within the points themselves. In the case of public schools, there are a handful of very powerful ways to filter. So the status of the schools, the grades that it covers by groups, the individual grades, total number of students, student-teacher ratio, is it a magnet school, is it a charter school, and so forth. So all these are variables that are in each school that you can use to filter by. So something simple like, can I show just middle schools on the map? And the map redraw, and now only middle schools will appear on the map at once. But filters are neat because you can combine filters together. So in this case, I can say I want to see middle schools and high schools in this query. And so now it'll show both middle schools and high schools. So it's going to cover grades 7th all the way to 12th. You can also combine filters from other categories. So in this case, I can say of the schools at a middle school and high school, I want to find ones that have fewer than 250 students. And so now only schools that match both criteria of middle school and high school or high school and have fewer than 250 students will appear on the map. So the filters are neat for points. And in the case of points, you can customize the icons, the colors, the shapes, and such. And the reason for that is that you can add multiple point data sets in the map at the same time. So you can add data sets that you've uploaded using the data loader, which we'll show, but also some simple ones that are in the PolicyMap tool, let's say hospitals in the map. And so that way you can show a map that presents your points that you filtered, or points data sets of one set and then another point data set of another set. Yeah, so points are simple. It is one of the easiest ones. The biggest takeaway, as you can see again, is that there are really powerful ways to filter points. If you just take a moment to look at the filters from the legend itself. And I'm going to put income back on the map, and I'll kind of wrap the first half of our session up because this is basic how to make a map. And that is, as you can see, you can have layer data and point data sets at the same time. So now you can have these really neat maps that hopefully can convey different how these two types of data might interact with each other. If you want to take this map offline and be able to email it to somebody or print it out or put it into a Word document, PowerPoint, or your presentation or application, from the maps page, there will be a print icon in the bottom right-hand corner here. And this will open up a really simple modal. And then within this modal, you can still pan around within the window. You can zoom in and out using your mouse wheel. We're going to add a little navigation zoom here eventually. But within this window, you have the ability to customize the map itself, because what you see in this window is exactly what you're going to export. So that way you can change the title of the map itself. If you're working on a program or a project or an application, this allows you to put that title into that work. And on the right-hand side are ways to further customize it. So you can change the font size, you can change the orientation of the map. So some places are much more vertical. You can add margins, you can change the format. How do you want to use it? Add and remove legends and such. But when you're done, click on the save, and this will basically download a copy of this onto your desktop. And then from there, you can do whatever you want with that copy in that format. And that's the basics of the PolicyMap maps. Any questions I can answer about how to use the tool? Okay.
I think, yeah, I think the navigating the maps is pretty good. That was a lot to do.
Yeah. The big takeaway, a lot of users is just take a moment to look at the legend when you add data to the map, because as you can see, there's so many really unique ways to customize that data, and you might just miss it sometimes, and the default settings might not be what you're looking for it to display. Okay, so let me show you just some of the more advanced features of the tool. And then from this, if you have any questions or anything you want to do in more specific, I'm happy to go through that process. But I'm going to show you two pretty important features within PolicyMap, and then how you can use it within your work, hopefully. And then one of those features is actually in what we call the legacy version of PolicyMap. If you're not familiar with PolicyMap, we are undergoing a pretty large upgrade to the technology and the infrastructure. And so what we are currently seeing today is we call it the beta, but it's the new version of PolicyMap. And there are some features that we are still working on, and they're only available in the legacy, and that is the link in the very top here. So this takes you to the old version of PolicyMap. And the reason for this is that we're finishing some of these features at this time, but you can always go back and forth between the two. And the one really important thing about these two things is that they are mirrored. So that way, if you make something in the new version PolicyMap or in the old version, they will be available between the two. So here are my two custom regions that I created, which I can still use them on the legacy version of PolicyMap. So you're never going to lose anything as you make things between one and the other for now. But one of the really unique features that we're finishing is the ability to, one thing you can do, if you can mute yourself real quick, I'm sorry. One of the really important features is the ability to add your own data onto the tool, and that's the data loader link in the very top here. And this data loader is what we call an address-based data loading tool. So that means that if you have data at geographies like zip codes or cities or counties and such, we do not have, the data loader doesn't load that data at this time. It's something that we can do through a process, through our data services team. And it's something we're going to add hopefully next year in the future. So we're pretty close to adding it. But for now, you probably have spreadsheets of addresses, and this is the exact tool you want to try to use to upload. The data loader is one of the easiest features within PolicyMap because it is a very straightforward function. So you're going to choose the option to upload points, give it a custom name. I always have a lot of choose how you want to share it. So myself only means that only your login will have access to this data. So if there are any privacy rules that you need to connect to, this basically allows you to do just that. The way we upload data, we take your data from your desktop to the cloud, so there's no tools in between. So it does allow us to be HIPAA compliant in how data is handled within PolicyMap. There are ways to share data sets with other users, and I'll show us that in a moment, but just understand that myself only means that only your login will have access to this data set. So simple things, changing the icons, the color, and the size. And then other than that, find your file. And so setting up a data set in PolicyMap is, as you can see, the easiest thing in our process. So it does mean the hardest thing, though, is the file itself to upload. And because the tool is an address-based data loading tool, the only thing that we require from our users is the address, city, state, and zip combination. So you can have address and zip if you wanted to, or you can have address, city, and state if you wanted to, or all four. The rest of this information you see in this file here is up to you. It's completely dynamic to the user. You can have nothing at all and just have the address and use the address as your data set to kind of understand the addresses themselves. Or in this case, this is a public library file that I pulled from our tool, and this can have as much information as you want. There is a limit per file at this time, and it's something that we are working on as an infrastructure update. So the limit itself will be upgraded fairly soon to a much larger file. So each file can have up to 5,000 addresses, so 5,000 rows in the file, and up to 45 columns of data associated to each address. So you can really see how much data you can put in a file. But it does mean that if you have data sets that are 20,000 or even 50,000, at this time, you'll need to break it up into chunks of 5,000. I'll show you as we get through the session a little bit. You can display all of them at once. You can have a complete image of all 50,000 addresses if you wanted to, but the process itself uploading is one file at a time of those chunks of 5,000. It was at 10,000 as early as last month. So we'll having those numbers back up to larger amounts fairly soon. Otherwise, save it as a CSV, and then again, go through the process of uploading the spreadsheet. You'll see this page once. This is just going to try to identify the address city state that we talked about. If for whatever reason one of these fields isn't up here, that's going to be down here. And this is where you can select and say, well, this should have been address 1, this should have been city or state, and we'll use that in the geocoding process. Otherwise, once it's done, what it'll do is it'll upload the file and it'll basically recreate your spreadsheet into this web interface. And then it'll give you some tips in the very top, telling you things like the match rate. So in this case, it's telling us of my 128 addresses, 120 were found. It'll let you know that you can sort the columns just like an Excel spreadsheet. And then the first column is, and you can edit the data within each field. So allowing you to make changes to the data set you've uploaded. But the first column by sorting is probably the most important one because it's going to tell you that anything in the red circle were addresses that failed for whatever reason, and anything in the greens were the ones that found. And you can sort and group them together then. And it does mean that you can go in here and then edit the data. These are some of the more common mistakes when it comes to geocoding. So things like cross streets. And you can see it'll geocode the addresses on the fly while you're in there. But when you're done, click Save and Close. And that's really how simple it should take you from going from a spreadsheet of addresses on your desktop to being able to visualize those addresses as points in the map, and then being able to interact with those points in that process.
Yeah, I think I already have one of our programs, our rental assistance program, that I entered a bunch of addresses in. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so the neat thing about this is once you have data set that's here and maybe you want to make it shareable with other users within the organization, then you can start using the share feature. So there's 2 unique ways to share it. The select individual allows you to basically identify each person that you want to share that data set with, and so those persons will have access to the data. Publicly shareable means that you can use the share feature to share with anybody else. You don't have to identify the persons at that time, but the people that you share it with can also then share with other users. So the goal of really public shareable is to make it, to kind of put it out there for anyone to access and then other users to share with other users. But at any time, you can turn off and on the share. So if you wanted to retract a shared data set from other users, go back in your data set, select myself only, and it takes it away from everyone's accounts and access. And then the last part of the data loader is that how you use it in PolicyMap is definitely up to you. And there's some really unique ways to use it. I'm going to take us to the new version of PolicyMap. So data sets that you've uploaded will be available in the very first tab, the My Data tab. So these are any data sets that you've uploaded using the data loader or that we've uploaded for your organization in this process. Data sets that are shared with you will be available here, which will be turned on for users in a moment. But otherwise, you can add your point data sets to the map. And then from this, you can visualize your points alongside all the other parts of PolicyMap. So you can add layer data and find out of your areas where there are relationships to something simple like income. But probably one of the most unique ways to use a point data set is that you can join you can take your data and put it into the tables page. And what this allows you to do then is join data, join your point data sets to a layer data. So the way the download works in PolicyMap is that it initially allows you to download layer data or if I change this to points, it'll download the point data sets. From the download function, that's what you can download initially, either layer data or points. But the third one is probably one of the most unique ways to download data in PolicyMap, and that's being able to join your point data set to a data layer. So in this case, I'm joining my uploaded data sets to the, let's say, zip codes, and giving us the median house income for the zip codes that each address sits in. So the ability to actually join points and layers is one of the cool features of the download tool itself. So if you wanted to add some context to your rental data sets, you can now display that point data set on the map and start adding any of the underlying data layers that you want to see more information about each address onto it. And then you can join those two things together.
Pretty darn cool.
Yeah, and that's really the big takeaway. So the way the download works in PolicyMap is that it's tied to this sidebar feature. And again, to access this, you just need to identify the geography in the location bar in the very top. So you can do the entire US if you wanted to in this download. So take a moment to zoom out. And then, so that way, whatever you download will be for the entire US. We have a full download function that we're completing again, and that's in the legacy still. And that is basically this feature here. So it's very similar to what we did to the sidebar. The difference is you're going through a modal to download versus going through the sidebar. And that's the only difference. The feature is the same. The output is the same. So you'll always have a spreadsheet of geographies and the value for those geographies and the FIPS codes for those values. And you can just make a bunch of these individual downloads and join them together to make a complete spreadsheet. All right, I covered a lot. I apologize if it's a little too much sometimes. If you do have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. You can also access a lot of these tutorials if you want to learn some of this on your own from the support link at the very top. I'll send everyone these links so that way you can go through some of these features on your own. They're very straightforward once you get an idea of how the overall tool works. But at any time, you're always welcome to email us. We're happy to go through some very specific ways that you want to use the tool, use cases, and just basically walk you through that process until you get comfortable with it itself.
It sounds good to me. If no one else has any questions, then yeah. I think it'll be real useful for a lot of stuff we're going to be doing.
All right, great. Yeah, if you have any questions as you use it, if you run into situations, data, features, always email us. We're happy to answer those questions. But I will share links to everything we talked about, the data directory, the dictionary, support pages, and then the video itself. So that way, if you want to go through this again or pick parts out later on, you're welcome to as well.